In the autumn of 1888, the world decided Elspeth Gray was a burden to be disposed of. The good people of Redemption, Wyoming, a town that clung to the dusty plains like a burr on a saddle blanket, called it charity. They arranged a marriage, a transaction. They traded their spinster, their silent shame, for a generous donation to the church roof fund from the man who lived on the ridge. The man they called the Beast. But what the town council and the smug Reverend Miller didn't know was that worth is not a thing to be measured by a congregation's whispers or a woman's marital status. This is Elspeth's story, a tale of what the world called worthless and what proved to be the bedrock of a home. She was 42 years old, a fact stated with the same finality as a death certificate. Her brother's passing had left her with nothing but his debts and a small worn Bible. She had hands made for work and a mind that still found solace in the written word. But in Redemption, a woman alone was a problem to be solved. And their solution was Gideon Blackwood. The meeting was held in the Reverend's stuffy office, smelling of old paper and judgment. Elspeth sat straight-backed, her hands folded in the lap of her only good dress, a faded calico that had seen a decade of careful mending. She did not look at the man who had purchased her future. She looked at the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of afternoon light, each one a tiny world, adrift and without purpose. Like her. Mr. Blackwood requires a wife, Reverend Miller had said, his voice slick with false piety. For propriety's sake, he has taken in his late sister's children, 2 young girls. They need a woman's influence, and he needs a housekeeper. A wife for propriety, a mother for orphans, a housekeeper for a beast. The roles were listed like items in a general store ledger. Elspeth's silence was taken as assent. It always was. Gideon Blackwood said nothing through the entire proceeding. He stood by the window, a figure of daunting size, his shadow swallowing the room. When he finally turned, Elspeth forced herself to look. The stories were true. The left side of his face was a ruin of puckered, discoloured skin, pulling the corner of his eye and mouth into a permanent, unsettling grimace. The fire, they whispered. The fire that took his wife and son years ago had marked him, inside and out. His good eye, a startlingly clear grey, met hers for a single, unreadable moment. It held no malice. It held nothing at all. Just a vast, empty distance. He placed a heavy leather pouch on the Reverend's desk. The clink of coins was obscene. The price of a woman. The journey to his ranch was made in that same profound silence. He drove the wagon with a steady, competent hand, the thick, scarred knuckles of his left hand resting on his knee. The road climbed from the flat, judgmental plains into the stark, lonely beauty of the foothills. The wind grew colder, carrying the scent of pine and stone. It was a clean smell, an honest smell. It scoured the scent of the Reverend's office from her lungs. The town of Redemption fell away behind them, a collection of small sins and smaller mercies, until it was nothing more than a smudge against the horizon. Elspeth felt a strange loosening in her chest. She was leaving the only world she had ever known, a world that had measured her and found her wanting. Whatever lay ahead could not be worse than the slow suffocation of pity. His ranch was nestled in a high valley, protected on 3 sides by stony ridges. The house was not a monster's lair. It was a simple, sturdy structure of hewn logs, chinked tight against the wind. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a lonely signal in the vast emptiness. Everything was ruthlessly practical. The barn was well maintained. The fences were taut. The woodpile was high and neat. It was the home of a man who understood work, a man who fought the wilderness not with rage, but with relentless, grinding effort. But it was not a home. It was a shelter, a place to survive. 2 small figures stood on the porch, motionless as statues. Girls, one perhaps 8, the other younger. They had identical dark hair and wide, wary eyes. They watched the wagon approach with the unnerving stillness of hunted animals. They did not run to greet him. They simply waited. Gideon brought the wagon to a halt. "This is Elspeth," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. He did not say, "My wife," or "your new mother." He just said her name. "She will be staying." The girls, Anna and Rose, stared at her. Their faces were pinched with a grief too old for their years. They saw another stranger, another change in a world that had already been turned upside down. He showed her to a small room at the back of the house. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out not at the valley, but at the sheer rock face of the ridge behind the house. It felt like the end of the world. The room was clean, starkly, brutally clean. "You will be safe here," he said, his scarred face impassive. He stood in the doorway, not crossing the threshold. It was a promise, a boundary. She was a housekeeper. He was the master of the house. The piece of paper they had signed in the Reverend's office was a lie they would both live by. That night, she lay in the narrow bed and listened to the house settle. She heard the floorboards creak under his heavy tread, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the children, the final, solid thud of his bedroom door closing. And then, only the wind. It was a lonely sound, a desolate sound, but it was honest. Here, on this ridge, there were no whispers. There was only the wind and the work and the silence. It was a beginning of a different kind. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Elspeth rose before dawn, the cold floorboards a shock to her bare feet. She stoked the fire in the great iron stove that dominated the kitchen, its warmth a small pocket of civilization against the encroaching chill of late autumn. She learned the geography of the house, the loose floorboard by the pantry, the way the western window rattled in the wind, the particular scent of wood smoke, coffee, and old sorrows that clung to the walls. Her hands, softened by years of needlework and quiet housekeeping for her brother, rediscovered the rough comfort of labour. She scrubbed floors, kneaded bread until her arms ached, mended the girls' torn dresses with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. The house began to change under her care. It was a slow, quiet transformation. A jar of late-blooming wildflowers appeared on the kitchen table. The curtains, once grey with dust, were washed and hung, letting in a brighter, cleaner light. The smell of baking bread began to overlay the scent of grief. Gideon remained a creature of the outdoors. He was gone before she lit the first lamp and returned long after dark, his face etched with exhaustion, his clothes carrying the scent of pine, horse, and cold earth. He ate what she put before him without comment, his eyes on his plate. They existed in a state of near-perfect silence, orbiting each other like planets held in place by a force they did not understand. Their conversations were transactions of necessity. "The flour is low," she would say. "I will see to it," he would reply. The children were her constant, silent audience. Anna, the younger, with eyes as dark and deep as a well, would watch her from doorways, a small, ghost-like presence. Rose, the elder, was more openly hostile. She watched Elspeth's hands as she worked, her small face set in a mask of suspicion. They were wild things, raised for a time by a grieving, broken man. They did not know the language of comfort. Elspeth did not push. She had been an outsider her entire life. She knew its bitter taste. She simply provided what she could. Warmth, food, cleanliness, consistency. She spoke to them quietly, expecting no reply. "The soup is hot, Rose." "Anna, your coat is mended." She was a steady presence, as reliable and unremarkable as the sunrise. She did not ask for their affection. She did not ask for anything. In the long, quiet afternoons, while the girls were occupied with their small, secret games, Elspeth would take out her Bible. It was the one thing that was truly hers. The pages were soft as cloth, the spine held together with careful stitches. Reading was a quiet act of defiance. It was a reminder that she was more than a pair of hands. She was a mind, a soul. One afternoon, Rose came to stand beside her chair. She pointed a small, grubby finger at the page. "What do the marks say?" she asked, her first direct question. "They tell a story," Elspeth replied softly. "About a garden." Rose considered this, her brow furrowed. Then, without another word, she turned and left. But the next day, she stood there again, and the day after that. Gideon noticed the changes. He said nothing of the wildflowers or the brighter kitchen. But one evening, he came in from the barn and set a bucket on the porch. It was filled with fresh, warm milk, still smelling of the cow. He did not say it was for her. He simply left it where she would find it. It was his language. An offering made in the currency of work. The next week, a perfectly stacked cord of firewood appeared by the back door, split smaller than his usual logs, sized perfectly for the kitchen stove. These small, silent gestures were cracks in the wall of his isolation. They were acknowledgements. He saw her work. He saw her. One evening, unable to sleep, Elspeth wandered into the main room. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a low, red glow. A book lay open on the small table beside Gideon's chair. She picked it up. The cover was worn leather, the pages foxed with age. It was not a Bible or an almanac. It was Shakespeare, the tragedy of King Lear. She stood there for a long time, the heavy book in her hands. The beast of redemption, the silent, scarred brute, read Shakespeare. The world had told her one story about this man, but the story he kept for himself, in the quiet of the night, was altogether different. The discovery settled in her heart like a warm stone. He was not what they said. And perhaps, she thought, looking at her own worn hands, neither was she. They were two people misread by the world, living in a house of silence, each learning to read the other. Not by words, but by the quiet evidence of their days. The first snow came without warning, a whisper of white that thickened into a blinding curtain, erasing the world. The wind howled down from the high peaks, a physical presence that battered the log walls and screamed in the chimney. The blizzard locked them in, pressing the four of them together in the small bubble of warmth and light. The silence of the house changed. It was no longer a silence of distance, but one of shared confinement. The world shrank to the dimensions of the cabin. The rhythms of their life, once spread across acres of land, were now contained within four walls. Elspeth could hear Gideon's steady breathing from his room across the hall at night. She could see the tension in his shoulders as he stared out the window at the endless white, a farmer tethered from his land. The girls, restless and bored, grew bolder, their small skirmishes and sudden peals of laughter filling the quiet spaces. It was on the third day of the storm that Anna's fever began. It started as a flush on her cheeks, a listlessness in her movements. By nightfall, she was burning, her small body trembling under a mountain of quilts. She whimpered in her sleep, calling for a mother she barely remembered. Elspeth was plunged back into a world she knew too well. She had nursed her brother through his final illness, a long losing battle against a wasting cough. She knew the grim rituals of the sick room, the cool cloths, the spoonfuls of broth, the long, watchful nights. She moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, her hands gentle but firm. Gideon was lost. This was an enemy he could not fight with his fists or his axe. He paced the main room like a caged animal, his helplessness a palpable force. He would stand in the doorway of the girls' room, his large frame filling the space, his scarred face a mask of raw fear. He, who could face down a blizzard or a predator, was terrified of a child's fever. He saw another loss, another failure he was powerless to prevent. "She needs a doctor," he rasped, his good eye wild. "There is no doctor to be had," Elspeth said calmly, wringing out a cloth in a bowl of cool water. "The snow is 10 feet deep on the pass. We are all there is." He had to trust her. He had no choice. He watched her as she worked through the night, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a single lantern. He saw the steady competence in her hands as she bathed Anna's face, the deep exhaustion in her eyes that she refused to yield to. He was not watching a housekeeper. He was not watching the woman the town had sold him. He was watching a strength he did not possess, a tenderness he had forgotten existed. Toward dawn, with the wind still shrieking outside, he brought her a mug of coffee. He stood beside the bed, watching the sleeping child. The silence between them was different now. It was filled with the shared weight of their fear. "The fire," he said suddenly, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the past. "It was a lantern, knocked over in the barn. Hay went up like tinder." Elspeth stopped, the cloth in her hands. She listened. "I got to them, to Mary and the boy. But the smoke, I couldn't see. The roof came down." He touched his scarred cheek with his good hand, a gesture of terrible, unconscious memory. "I was the only one who came out. They called me a hero for trying." His voice was thick with self-loathing. A man who fails to save his own wife and son is no hero. The town saw the scars on his face and imagined a monster who had survived a blaze. He saw them and knew only the faces of those he had lost in the smoke. Elspeth looked from his ravaged face to the sleeping child. She thought of the wood he chopped for her stove, the pail of milk, the book of poetry he read alone in the dark. She thought of his terror now, a terror born not of monstrosity, but of a love so profound it had nearly destroyed him. She did not offer him empty words of comfort. She offered him the truth as she saw it. "You did not fail these girls," she said, her voice quiet but firm in the dim light. "You came for them. You brought them here." His gaze lifted from the child and met hers. For the first time, the vast, empty distance in his eye was gone. In its place was a flicker of something raw and vulnerable. A man seen not as a beast or a failure, but simply as a man. It was an absolution he had never been given. It was a grace delivered in a quiet voice, in the heart of a storm. The fever broke with the dawn. One moment Anna was a trembling, heated thing, and the next a profound stillness fell over her. Her skin, which had been burning to the touch, was now merely warm, damp with sweat. She was sleeping a true, healing sleep. The storm outside quieted to a whisper, and a pale, watery light began to seep through the windows. The world, both inside and out, was washed clean. Anna's recovery was the pivot on which their small world turned. When she finally woke, her dark eyes clear and lucid, the first person she asked for was not Gideon. "Elspeth?" she whispered, her voice thin as a thread. It was more than a name. It was an acceptance. From that day forward, the house was different. The silence was no longer a wall between them, but a shared space, comfortable and understood. The girls, led by a newly devoted Anna, began to orbit Elspeth not with suspicion, but with a quiet need. Rose started bringing her things: a smooth river stone, a bird's feather, a misshapen flower, the silent offerings of a child's heart. Gideon began to speak, not in long conversations, but in small observations shared over the dinner table. He spoke of the land, of the way the creek would rise in the spring, of a hawk he had seen circling the high peaks. He was sharing his world with her, piece by piece. He started to look at her when he spoke, his good eye meeting hers directly, holding her gaze. He was learning to be seen again. He asked her about the books she read. One evening, he brought his worn copy of Shakespeare to the fire and read aloud, his deep voice stumbling at first, then growing in confidence as he lost himself in the words. The girls sat on the floor, mesmerized by the rhythm and thunder of the language they did not understand. Elspeth sat with her mending in her lap, listening to the story of a broken king, read by a man who was slowly piecing himself back together. The most profound change came a week after the storm. Gideon spent 2 days in his workshop, the sound of sawing and hammering echoing across the snow-covered yard. Elspeth assumed he was repairing a piece of equipment, but on the third evening, he carried his creation into the house. It was a small, simple bookshelf, made of fragrant pine, sanded smooth as glass. He set it down on the wall beside her chair in the main room. He did not say a word. He just looked at her, a question in his eyes. Elspeth understood. She went to her room and returned with her Bible and the two other worn books she owned, her only inheritance. She placed them carefully on the shelves. They looked small and lonely in the new space, but they were a beginning. The bookshelf was more than a piece of furniture. It was a statement. It was a place for her things in his house. It was an anchor. It was his way of saying, "You belong here. Your mind, your soul, the parts of you that live in these pages, they belong here too." She ran her hand over the smooth wood. The feeling of being temporary, a hired hand, a purchased solution, began to dissolve. It was replaced by a feeling so new and fragile she hardly dared to name it. The simple log structure, once a mere shelter from the elements, was slowly, inexplicably becoming a home. She was not just staying, she was staying on. When the snows finally melted, revealing a world green and teeming with new life, the town of Redemption remembered them. The track up to the ridge became passable again, and with the spring thaw came the long shadow of Reverend Miller. He arrived one Tuesday afternoon, his buggy looking sleek and out of place in the muddy yard. He came, he said, on a pastoral visit to check on Elspeth's welfare. In truth, he came to inspect his investment. He stepped into the house and stopped, his small eyes taking in the changes. He saw the clean curtains, the jar of pussy willows on the table, the bookshelf on the wall. He saw the two girls, who stopped their play to stand near Elspeth, their small hands clutching at her skirts. He saw the way they looked at her, with an open, trusting affection that had been absent before. And he saw Gideon, who had come in from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, standing not as a master before his servant, but as a man beside his wife. The Reverend's face tightened. This was not the arrangement he had brokered. He had solved a problem by pairing a burden with a beast. He had not intended to create a family. He saw his control, his moral authority, slipping away. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice oozing a concern that was patently false. "It is good to see you well. We have been most concerned for you, isolated up here all winter with your husband." He let the word hang in the air, weighted with insinuation. Elspeth simply nodded, her hand resting on Anna's head. "I have been well, Reverend. Thank you." "These children seem attached to you," he observed, a note of disapproval in his tone. "Mr. Blackwood, the town council has expressed some concern. A man of your circumstances, raising two young girls alone, it is not ideal. There is talk of making them wards of the church. For their own good, you understand." The threat was clear. He was reminding them of his power, of the world's judgment that waited just down the ridge. He was threatening to tear their fragile home apart. A year ago, Elspeth would have shrunk from his gaze, her shame a heavy cloak. She would have deferred to his authority, her voice a mere whisper. But the woman who had nursed a child through a fever, who had listened to a man's broken heart in the dead of night, who had been given a place for her books, was not the same woman who had been sold in his office. She straightened her shoulders. She looked the Reverend directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and unwavering. "This is their home, Reverend," she said, her voice low but carrying the weight of conviction. "And I am their mother, not in name, in truth." Gideon had been silent, watching, letting her claim her space. Now he moved. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply came to stand beside her, so close their shoulders brushed. He placed his large, scarred hand on her arm, a silent, unshakable declaration of unity. The gesture was more powerful than any weapon. "My wife has spoken," Gideon said, his voice a quiet rumble that held the promise of thunder. "This is my land, this is my home, and this is my family. You will leave us to it." The Reverend's face mottled with fury. He had come expecting a monster and a victim. He found instead a fortress. He saw two people, dismissed by his world as broken and worthless, standing together as a single, indivisible whole. He had lost. He turned without another word, his dignity in tatters, and climbed back into his buggy. As he drove away, Elspeth watched him go, Gideon's hand still a warm, steady weight on her arm. The town of redemption, with its whispers and its judgments, seemed very far away. It no longer had the power to define them. They had defined themselves. The transaction was over. What remained was a bond forged in a blizzard, built with silent acts of kindness, and now sealed in a moment of shared defiance. They were no longer two separate, lonely people. They were a family, and they were home. The departure of the Reverend left a profound quiet in its wake. The threat had passed, but it had burned away the last of the pretense between them. They were no longer playing the roles assigned to them, the housekeeper and the employer, the wife in name and the husband of convenience. They had stood together, claiming each other in the face of the world. The truth of what they had become was now undeniable, a living thing in the small log house. They moved through the evening chores in a new awareness of each other. The air was charged, not with tension, but with an unspoken tenderness. Every small gesture was freighted with meaning. When he passed her the water bucket, his fingers brushed hers, and a current passed between them that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with a deep, burgeoning affection. That night, after the girls were asleep, they sat before the fire as they often did. But instead of reading, Gideon watched the flames, his scarred face thoughtful in the flickering light. Elspeth continued with her mending, the rhythmic pull of the needle a comforting sound in the quiet room. Finally, he rose and went to a small wooden chest in the corner, a chest she had never seen him open. He knelt before it, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and lifted the lid. He rummaged inside for a moment before closing it and returning to the fire. He stood before her and held out his hand. Lying on his broad, calloused palm was a ring. It was not a grand piece of jewelry. It was a simple, thin band of gold, worn smooth with time. It held no stone, only the faint, engraved memory of entwined ivy. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She gave it to my father when they were wed. He gave it to me for Mary." He paused, the name of his first wife hanging in the air between them, a ghost acknowledged with sorrow, not shame. "It belongs in this house, with the woman of this house." He did not ask her to be his wife. They had already signed that paper. He was asking for something more. He was asking her to take her rightful place, not as a housekeeper, but as his partner, as the heart of the home they had built together. "It is yours," he said, his gaze holding hers, his good eye filled with a depth of feeling that stole her breath. "If you will have it." Elspeth put down her sewing. Her hands were trembling slightly. She looked at the ring, a small, perfect circle of gold, a symbol of a promise without end. She thought of the cold transaction in the Reverend's office, the clink of coins that had sealed her fate. She thought of this man, who had offered her safety, then respect, and now his own bruised and battered heart. She held out her left hand. Gideon took it, his touch surprisingly gentle. His scarred fingers, accustomed to the rough work of the ranch, were careful as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It felt warm, as if it still held the heat of the lives it had known. It was their true wedding. No church, no witnesses, save for the silent, watching flames. A vow made not with words, but with a simple, profound gesture. A circle of gold to bind two broken people into a whole. Later, when she went to her small room at the back of the house, she found he had moved her things. Her few belongings, her books, and her sewing basket were now in his room, placed carefully on the dresser beside his. Her bed had been moved next to his. He had made a space for her. She stood in the doorway, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. He was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit valley. He turned to her, the question clear on his face. She walked into the room and closed the door behind her. That night, for the first time, she did not sleep alone. She slept beside her husband, wrapped in a quiet and gentle strength, finally and completely home. The seasons turned on the ridge. Summer came, painting the high meadows with wildflowers. Autumn followed, setting the aspens ablaze with gold. Winter returned, blanketing their world in a peaceful, solemn white. Their life fell into a new rhythm, a harmony of shared work and quiet companionship. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of the girls' laughter, the murmur of voices reading by the fire, the easy cadence of a life lived in partnership. Elspeth taught the girls to read and write, to bake bread and mend a seam. She taught them the names of the wildflowers and the constellations. She gave them the childhood that had been stolen from them, a gift of stability and unconditional love. They blossomed under her care, their wary eyes softening, their pinched faces growing round and happy. Gideon taught her the language of the land. He showed her how to read the clouds for weather, how to find the first wild strawberries in the spring, how to gentle a foal. He shared his work with her, and in doing so, shared himself. They were a team, their strengths and skills complementing each other perfectly. The ranch prospered under their joint care. The fences were stronger, the herd was larger, the garden was more bountiful. Their life was a testament to the quiet power of steadfast daily effort. Years passed. The world below in Redemption went on with its business, its gossip, and its judgments. But it was a distant noise, like the buzz of a fly on a summer afternoon. The story of the beast and his purchased wife faded, replaced by the reality of the Blackwood family. A quiet, hard-working, and respectable unit that kept to itself and thrived. One late summer evening, nearly a decade after she had first arrived, Elspeth stood on the porch, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. She was over 50 now. Her hair was threaded with silver, and her face held the fine lines of time and weather, but her eyes were serene. Her hands, resting on the porch rail, were no longer the hands of a destitute spinster. They were the strong, capable hands of a wife, a mother, a rancher. They were the hands that had built a life. Gideon came to stand beside her, his arms settling around her shoulders with familiar comfort. The scars on his face were still there, a permanent map of his past, but she no longer saw them. She saw only the man she loved, the quiet, gentle soul the world had been too blind to see. His good eye, as he looked at her, was filled with a deep and abiding peace. Anna and Rose, now tall, bright young women, came out of the house, laughing over some shared secret. They were poised on the cusp of their own lives, their futures a bright, open country, their past a healed-over wound. They were strong and kind and confident, the living proof of the love that had raised them. The world had sold a woman it deemed worthless to a man it called a monster. It had been a transaction of convenience, an act of cold, pragmatic charity. But on that ridge, under the vast Wyoming sky, they had built something the world could never understand. They had built a life more valuable than any gold, a family chosen not by blood, but by the steady, quiet work of love. Gideon's scarred hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own. They fit together perfectly. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last sliver of sun disappear, leaving the sky awash in purple and gold. No words were needed. They had said everything that mattered long ago, in unspoken acts of kindness, in shared glances across a firelit room, in the simple, profound choice to stand together. Theirs was a love story written not in poetry, but in the prose of everyday life, and it was the most beautiful story she had ever known.